Hi all, and welcome to the Medical AI Lab group session. Today, I'm delighted that we have Nikhil Datar talking to us about post-research deployment challenges for medical AI. Without further ado, take it away, Nikhil.
Thank you. Yeah, so today I'll be talking about post-research deployment challenges for medical AI. And I hope that throughout today's talk, you'll gain a better understanding for why we need to address these challenges and how doing so would allow for smoother transition between the machine learning research and actual clinical deployment. Now, throughout today's talk, you'll have several learnings. First, you'll gain an understanding for a variety of challenges facing machine learning researchers regarding post-research clinical deployment. You'll gain an understanding for proposed solutions to some of these challenges. And hopefully you'll learn how to categorize and group these challenges to easily identify and address them when conducting your own research. Now, let's talk about motivation for why we want to talk about these post-research deployment challenges. AI research in healthcare is accelerating across a wide variety of applications, from chest X-ray interpretation to cancer detection from mammograms, to polyp detection from colonoscopy, and so on. But despite this, there are only a few examples of successful deployment into clinical practice. Now, if we can understand the challenges of post-research deployment, then we can better understand how to tailor our research in the first place. Let's talk about further motivation and really how AI has the most potential in clinical applications. AI has the potential to reduce unwanted and unwarranted variation of diagnosis in clinical practice and improve efficiency, both time efficiency and cost efficiency. So while physicians may differ in the way that they diagnose patients across different institutions, AI serves as a way to provide consistency in diagnosis. And also, if enough AI applications were deployed in clinical practice, it would have an impact in almost every patient at some point in their lives, just due to the scalability and wide variety that AI applications provide. Really would allow for primary care physicians to feel more confident in assessing a larger variety of diseases and medical challenges, because they have a tool that has been trained on thousands and hundreds of thousands of images and other types of data. And even if they may not be experts in that area, then they still can use that tool for their benefit in patient care. And it also would help with novel signal and biological marker discovery, which experts are often unable to perceive. So if there's someone that has breast cancer, an AI tool may help to discover new markers that can help identify breast cancer that a human may not be able to see. Now, throughout today's talk, we're first going to go through challenges related to actual clinical translation of machine learning models and some of the subsections under that. We're then going to dive into challenges related to the machine learning science itself, related to model architecture, as well as the data itself. And finally, we're going to talk about how we can frame challenges within the benchmark evaluation process. All right, so let's get started with challenges regarding clinical translation of machine learning models. And we're going to start off with retrospective versus prospective studies. Now, what are prospective and retrospective studies? A prospective study is one which starts where a researcher may start with the study design, gather patients, and then test how effective some intervention is in real time, and then measure an outcome. Whereas a retrospective study is the opposite. It starts with the study design that's already been conducted, the intervention has already been made, and a researcher is simply trying to gather insights and outcomes from that historical data. Now, the problem with current clinical workflows is that most current studies in machine learning are retrospective. So this means that they're using historically labeled data to both train and test their algorithms, which means that they're not getting a better understanding of how these models actually fare when deployed in clinical practice. If we want to observe clinical effectiveness of AI systems, then we really need to be conducting more prospective studies for real-time patient monitoring. Now, this has already been done in limited settings, from diabetic retinopathy to breast cancer metastases, but really it could be done in more settings if we want to see the full potential of AI in clinical applications being realized. So let's look at that example of a breast cancer metastases study in which a prospective study was conducted, just to see an example of how this may be done. Let's say a model was trained on historically labeled data, and this study was actually conducted. So a model was trained on 5,545 colonoscopy images from just over 1,000 patients. And the way that this prospective study was done was that that model was taken and actually validated in real time in a clinical workflow. So there were patients that their colonoscopy images were taken, and that model was actually tested in real time to see how it would fare. Now, currently, models, maybe you'll take a historically labeled data set and split it and test that model on a portion of that historically labeled data set. And that's where the research ends. But if we really want to see how well models fare in clinical practice, we need to be taking it a step further and conducting these prospective studies. Let's move on to peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials. All right, so what exactly is a randomized controlled trial? So randomized controlled trial starts with some sample population that you take from an overall population distribution. You randomly split the patients in that trial into, in this case, let's say 2 groups. And one group may receive a new treatment and the other group stays with the control. And then at the end of the study, you compare the outcomes of the patients within the 2 groups to see if that new treatment was actually successful. So in a machine learning application, it may look like that intervention may look like the deployment of some tool for automatic detection of some patient's disease. And then you would see whether that actually augmenting that with a physician actually resulted in improved patient outcomes. Now, the problem with the current state of the clinical workflow is that the current state of machine learning research is that there simply aren't enough peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials being done. So there are many machine learning papers that are being published as preprints to preprint servers, but they're not subject to peer review. And so papers that advertise being improvements on state-of-the-arts or baseline models often would not actually be an improvement if deployed into clinical practice. And so really looking at how improving the way in which peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials are done would allow for better assessment of how these models fare when actually being deployed and how they are able to impact patient outcomes. Now, there's an example, a prime example of this, in which a randomized controlled trial of a system called Infant was conducted to provide automated interpretation of cardiotopographs in labor. So Infant was just some AI tool that was being deployed and was advertised as, it would result in a benefit if deployed in clinical practice. But this is just one portion of the results. But we can see that within the 2 groups, the group with the decision support system, this Infant system, and the group with no decision support system, the results were fairly the same, and there was no significant difference in the assessed indicators really showing that there was no difference in the patient outcome. Now, there are several proposed solutions to solving the peer-reviewed randomized controlled trial problem. First, future studies can use clinical outcomes as trial endpoints for assessment of the benefit over a larger period of time. Additionally, it's important to recognize that different algorithms require changes in the sociocultural context, so additional methods of evaluation may be necessary. It may be necessary for algorithms that advertise themselves as improvements on state of the art to be actually assessed in a peer-reviewed randomized controlled trial, and even assessed in multiple across different institutions to really see how models fare in different clinical settings. Additionally, it's important for algorithms to be in accordance with documentation, with peer-reviewed documentation, because it's important to actually incentivize people to conduct these peer reviews. If a paper is published, if reports are published that are clunky and not easy to replicate, then it may be harder to incentivize someone to actually conduct peer review and get the findings that are supposedly improvements published. Awesome. Let's move on to really why metrics that are used in the current workflows, why they're not exactly reflective of clinical success. Now, there's this term that's been coined in recent years called the AI chasm, and it reflects the fact that most machine learning papers, most models that are developed are not actually put into production or deployed. Now, this also specifically relates to this idea of metrics not being reflective of patient outcomes. So, for example, one of the most common metrics is the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve. It's very difficult for clinicians to understand what this means sometimes. While the machine learning community has gotten used to using this metric in all kinds of research, physicians don't often encounter this. And so there's actually been studies to show that many of them don't actually understand what it means and how to assess patient outcomes and how to basically interpret results when given a model that is determining outcomes based on metrics like the AUROC. Basically, the point is that technical accuracy is not always the best measure of how well a model will fare when actually deployed in clinical practice. And it's important to consider other metrics too, like sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value, and so on, to really get a better understanding of all of the properties of a machine learning model and not just what we call technical accuracy. And even then, beyond those metrics may not actually be, even if we have several metrics that we include in our report, it may still not be representative of how well the model would fare in clinical practice, how well it would improve patient outcomes, how well it would improve workflow related to the actual healthcare workers themselves, how well it would improve time, efficiency, and so on. Now, some proposed solutions for actually solving this metric transferability problem from the research itself to deployment. One of the main ways that has been proposed is to use a decision curve analysis, where the net benefit of implementing an AI tool is compared with both an intervention for all and intervention for none baselines, as well as current models that basically are the state of the art or baselines. So in this case, the net benefit is plotted. It's calculated by taking the true positives, the true negatives, and multiplying that by some factor of a probability threshold. So you're basically comparing the net benefit of taking this new model within some acceptable probability threshold for a physician and seeing if that improves upon previous models or simply not including this new model within the clinical workflow. Basically, the point is that this new form of analysis is supposed to be more representative of how these models would affect patient outcomes than metrics that are currently being used in machine learning research. All right, let's move on to difficulty with algorithmic comparison. So one problem is that it's often difficult to actually compare the performance of different studies because each study is really reported using different methodologies, and performance is being tested on different data sets which come from different populations and therefore are different sample distributions, therefore have different sample distributions and characteristics. And so we want an algorithm that's basically able to be tested in a consistent manner, be tested on the same data set to actually have a way of comparing models that have been developed using these different methodologies. So one proposed solution is to have institutions create their own local test sets that are representative of their own local populations to test different models on. So let's say we train a model. So let's say a researcher trains a model using some historical data that they have, and they test it, and they see using whatever metric that they're using that there's some improvement in relation to the state of the art or the baseline model. Then they may send that model to an institution, a clinical institution, and then that institution can either test it immediately on their own local data, or first they can create an independent training set to fine tune that model on a more represented, a population that's more representative of the patients that actually attend that institution and get care from that institution. And then they can finally apply that to a local test set. And by doing so, they would really ensure that models are not judged based on how the researcher wants to assess performance. Rather, it's directly being tested on the patient population that actually attends that institution. And therefore, hopefully, when that model is deployed, it would result in improvements in performance. Now let's move on to challenges outside of the actual translation, but more focused on the actual machine learning science itself. And we're going to start off with data set or distribution shift. Now, the problem with data shift or distribution shift, that is the problem. And it occurs when the input data is non-stationary and is constantly changing. And this is very common in clinical settings because there's often changing clinical and operational practices that occur within different institutions. And that can basically change the population input distribution of the patients at a particular institution. Now, algorithms need to be tested on the same independent test sets and evaluated using the same performance metrics to ensure and really test to see how they fare in comparison to another when these data distribution shifts occur. So there's different types of data distribution shifts, including covariate shift, label shift, and concept shift. But really, I'm just gonna walk through one of them, covariate shift. It's the most common distribution or data distribution shift. And it occurs when the distribution of the input data is changing. So the distribution of the population input changes, while the distribution of the output given the input remains the same. So if we look at the joint distribution, we see that if the distribution of the input, p of x, is changing, while the distribution of the output given the input, p of y given x, remains the same, then the joint distribution is changing as well. And this can have significant impacts on performance when models are deployed in practice. because essentially what can happen is different features that were used to identify and basically predict, that the model used to predict on the training set are no longer present or may have completely changed along this changing population distribution. And so we really need to find a way in order to update models in order to allow for to actually prevent this data shift from occurring or mitigate the effects of it. So let's consider as just an example of what a data shift would look like. Let's consider a breast cancer classifier. Let's say that it was trained on some input, some set of women that are that tend to be above the age of 40, because women above the age of 40, it's known that they may have higher incidence of breast cancer, and so they may be going to screening more often than other women. And so let's say that if they had gone for a screen in the last 3 years, they may be more likely to have their data within this training set that the model within this data set that the model was trained on. Now let's say that we want to do inference on some population, but when we actually apply to that population, let's say that the age of the women within that distribution is not likely to be above 40 years old. So let's say that women from all ages tend to get screened, and what that can do is, what that is an example of sample selection bias, where the data that was used for training is not reflective of the actual population distribution. And therefore, when the model is applied through inference in the future, it would likely have performance drops and deterioration because the distribution that it was trained on is not reflective of the actual distribution that is being tested or inference is being run on. And so in this example, we can see that this is also an example of covariate shift. We think about the probability of the input being the distribution of the age of the women within this population. That has changed from the training input data to the inference data. And so that results in a change in the joint distribution and can result in worse prediction and worse performance on the actual inference. Now, there's several proposed solutions for preventing these distribution shifts. One of them is to allow for methods that actually identify and prevent these data drifts, such as quantification, measurement, and performance. So basically, with the data shift, over time, you'll see the performance of a model deteriorate. It will get worse. And so if there are quantification methods that are put in place to actually identify the performance of these models, if you see that the performance is deteriorating over time, then it's more likely that some distribution shift has occurred within the data, and you can take steps to address it further. Additionally, another key way to prevent this is periodic retraining of the model to actually accommodate a changing patient distribution. So obviously, if you retrain the model, then you're keeping up with the way that the distribution is changing. And so hopefully you'll be able to prevent significant performance drops. Now, one thing that's important to note is that it may be different how often this periodic retraining occurs. So the period between retraining may differ depending upon the actual task itself, depending on the cost to benefit ratio, how much cost it takes to retrain versus how much benefit is actually being achieved, and so on. It could take anywhere from a day to a month to even a year. All right, so the next challenge related to machine learning science would be confounding variables. So often models will use whatever signals that they can find within a data set to actually learn a particular task. So for example, let's say that a classifier, this has actually happened. So there's a classifier that classified skin lesions as malignant if the image actually contained a ruler, because malignant lesions tend to have rulers present in images. And there are several other examples as well, but this is just one that really highlights that models will use whatever signals and objects exist within the data to actually learn a particular task. And the problem with this is that not all data sets are going to have these confounding variables in them. And so if a model is using that confounding variable to learn the task, then when it's applied to a new data set that does not have that confounding variable, it's not going to be as successful in the task that it has learned, because it's not going to have that confounding variable to use. So since other data sets would not have, like I said, some other data sets would not have this marker, we want to avoid letting the model even learn this confounding variable in the first place. Now, let's move on to challenges with generalization of models to new populations. So it's often hard for these models to generalize to new populations because of the technical differences between actual sites. So, for example, there's often differences in equipment, coding definitions, electronic health records, and more that can result in difficulty applying a model to a new population. So the severity of this challenge often depends on the task itself. So for simpler tasks, such as medical image interpretation, classification or interpretation, this challenge often poses less of an issue because the data sets that these models have been trained on are often incorporate multiple or many institutions when the models are trained. However, for more difficult tasks, it actually may be necessary to generate new evaluation methods to identify out of distribution inputs, because we don't want to be running a model on data that is out of the distribution and then using the results from that in clinical practice and to assist physicians. We don't want physicians using wrong predictions and results that are not reflective of the actual patients. So a recent review actually was conducted, and it showed that only 6% of 516 eligible published studies performed external validation. So external validation refers to when a model is trained with data from one institution and then tested on data from an entirely new distribution, an entirely new population distribution, to hopefully see that and verify that the model is actually able to generalize to a new population and is not entirely dependent upon the population distribution that it was trained on. Now, there's several proposed solutions for fixing this issue with generalizing to new populations. So there should be site or institution-specific training to ensure reliability of a model. And as I talked about before, with the creation of local test sets, that also applies here. Local test sets would help to ensure that a model is actually generalizing well before it's being deployed. And again, with external validation, it's important to see really that a model can perform well on populations from different institutions. And there's also the issue with algorithmic bias. So algorithmic bias is pretty well known, I'd say, in the machine learning community. There have been several studies that have come up in recent years, like issues with facial recognition software for darker skinned individuals. And this also plays a role in medical applications of AI as well. There are three main sources of algorithmic bias. First one comes with bias in the model itself. So different models. So a researcher may have different models and they can be selected. The models may be selected to represent a majority of a population rather than represent the underrepresented groups within that population. There also might be model variance in which the data itself that is coming in for training is not really representative of an entire population. And this is likely what we think of when we think of algorithmic bias that we've heard in recent years. We think of facial recognition software and other methods of bias. We think of this because often the data sets that are used for training include a higher proportion of the individuals within that data set are fair-skinned, and that can have implications on even tasks and medical applications, as we'll get to. And also there's a set of unobserved variables. So these are unknown variables that interact with model predictions, and they are indeed avoidable by identifying further population subgroups. So basically identifying and breaking down the population further to actually identify what these underlying variables are. So a proposed solution for ensuring that these algorithms are generalizable. Sorry about that. So one example of this algorithmic bias would be and darker skinned individuals. So if we consider the task of identifying melanoma or cancerous or even just any type of skin lesion, algorithms often have a harder time predicting on darker skinned individuals, since most of the individuals in the training set, as I mentioned, are fair skinned. And that can have implications, especially because often these populations are the ones that are hardest hit by diseases related to skin lesions. And if we don't have algorithms that are able to predict on these populations, then with high accuracy, then basically we'd be suffering in the healthcare system. Now, proposed solutions to ensuring algorithms are generalizable would be really designing these algorithms with a global community in mind. So we don't want algorithms that are only incorporating individuals that are fair-skinned. We want data sets that basically are representative of the global community. And we want to have clinical validation on different populations and on the representative population that this machine learning model would be deployed, where this machine learning model would be deployed. It's also important to identify further population subgroups in order to prevent, if I go back, these unobserved variables from basically being unknown forever. If we identify further subgroups, we'd be able to identify, what these variables are, and we wouldn't have algorithmic bias. Now, there are also several additional problems related to machine learning science. There's the logistical issues. So often the data in clinical practice is not ready for machine learning and inference, for example, since it's stored in a variety of different mediums. These are often hard to coordinate, and really, if we need a system that is more standardized and can allow for faster implementation of machine learning research into clinical practice. So, for example, there's the fast healthcare interoperability resources that help create unified data formats and help basically make data aggregation easier. So even though data may be stored in different mediums, having it in these unified data formats would allow for faster deployment of these algorithms. And there's also the issue of regulation and regulatory frameworks. So this is a difficult topic because we're in a period of medical innovation in AI, and we don't want to slow this pace down. And we don't want to prevent the fluid nature and like creative freedom that currently exists in machine learning research. But we do want to allow for clinicians to actually trust the AI tools that we're giving them. We want them to have confidence in the tools and not worry about whether the tools are really being deployed with the right intentions and really would help patient outcomes. So these regulatory frameworks should consider improvements and changes over time, really, and be updated to allow for the changing pace of medical innovation that's happening in AI. Now, there's also the issue of creating explainable and interpretable AI. And this is a huge issue in, especially in medical applications, because we want patients to understand, why exactly, we want physicians to understand why exactly models are saying what they're saying. And we want patients to have more basically ownership of their clinical support. And so explainability would ensure that a model is not using confounding variables, for example, because if a physician or a researcher is able to understand why the model is making a specific prediction, then it would allow for us to retrace the variables in which it is using to make that prediction and identify whether any confounding variables actually exist. It also would help experts recognize system errors and know when models are using incorrect indicators. And that is essentially related to confounding variables. And it also would help us to identify new patterns and new ways of actually making predictions on the data, right? So like I mentioned earlier, AI has the potential to find new solutions and new ways of learning particular tasks that humans may not be able to comprehend. And so if we have explainable systems, then it definitely would allow for us to actually understand how the AI is learning a particular task. And we want patients to have essentially more ownership of their clinical support, and really creating explainable AI would definitely allow for this. There's also the entire issue of trade-off in explainability with performance, right? So often the best performing models, like neural networks and deep learning, are not as explainable as other models like linear regressions and random forests and whatnot. And I think understanding where this trade-off, the best point of this trade-off would definitely allow for better creation of models that would both serve with high accuracy, but also would allow for explainability to physicians. Now, let's move on to framing challenges within benchmark evaluation. So benchmark evaluation is the current process by which machine learning research improves upon itself. Let's say you have a baseline model or a benchmark, and you have some metric, and you improve on that. That could serve as an iteration of this process that we're going to get into. So let's talk about a framework for how we can actually think about this evaluation process. So first, we start off with a new algorithmic idea, and we want to train that model on some data. And after we've done that, we test that model on some test set. And then we see on that test set, is there an improvement over the existing methods, the existing baselines, the existing state-of-the-art models? And if so, then hopefully we get to apply the model to new data sets and to the real world, and hopefully make progress really in the clinical workflow. The key question is, to what extent does a data set, the model is trained on represents a task a paper claims it represents? So this question lends the creation of two distinct problem statements based on concrete problems defined via data sets and abstract problems defined with informal semantics. Now, what this means is we define a learning problem as a concrete problem that's defined via a data set. So in a learning problem is fully comprised by a data set of input and output pairs, as well as an associated evaluation metric. So as we touched on earlier, it can be like an F1 score, it can be multiple different things, but the point is that in this case, we're limiting a learning problem to just one metric in one data set. And an example of this would be the ImageNet, the ImageNet data set with top one accuracy as a metric. And we can think of tasks, on the other hand, as those abstract problems. The abstract problems that are defined with natural language and are not necessarily defined in a concrete manner by data set and metric. So these come at differing, so first of all, we don't have to establish a true definition for a task. And also they can exist at differing levels of specificity. So for example, there may be dog versus cat classification, maybe animal classification, there may be image classification, and all these combined help to create a task hierarchy. Now, if we look at this task hierarchy and in the space of a task universe and a learning problem universe, we see that task universe is indeed in a form of a hierarchy. So it goes down from computer vision, splits into segmentation and classification, and further is divided up into more specific tasks. Whereas a learning problem is really associated with a particular task, but can be fully defined by the data set and the metric. I thought it would be cool to think about this in sort of object-oriented programming like way. So tasks, we can think of tasks as classes. And at lower levels of the task hierarchy, the task inherits from a parent task. So a subtask may be more specific and may have more attributes, but may fall under a general task. And so we can think of that as like a subclass. Whereas we can think of the learning problem as instances of those classes. So we can define a particular task or a task class by the data set that we are testing the model on and the metric we're using to actually evaluate model performance. And just like object-oriented programming, learning problems contain attributes, like I mentioned, like the data set and the metric. Now, in order to think about this benchmark process, we can divide the failure modes into two evaluation categories. So first, we have internal validity, which refers to consistency within the experimental setup. And it's confined to a single learning problem or benchmark. And we also have external validity. And that's really all about the ability of the model to extrapolate and translate what it's learned on one learning problem to a broader task. And often this really comes to life in the form of like a real world example, the transition of ML research to the real world clinical applications. Now, we're going to talk about issues for both internal validity and external validity. And really one issue with internal validity is the implementation variations in the algorithm itself. So often these algorithms, the performance can be altered using these tricks. So for example, there's a study that, and the details of the study are not as important, but essentially they used a random seed to test, they used changing random seeds to test whether performance would be significantly altered. And indeed, if you look at the graph, over time, basically we saw that the performance of one random seed was significantly higher than the other. Now, there are also other tricks that can be used, like specific reporting of hyperparameters and other tricks as well have been used. But this was the main one that really they realized was having a significant impact on performance. There's also issues related to variation in metrics and libraries themselves. So metric scores can be altered by specifications for parameters. So like with the blue score, it's parameterized by a maximum n-gram length. And you also, unrelated to this, but you can also add or remove tokenization. And so often what happens is that these parameters are not reported in the literature. Researchers don't always report these parameters, even though they have changes in performance, even though they result in changes in performance. And so there's an issue with really how these metrics are being reported and the overall internal design of these studies themselves, because they're not being consistent across different iterations of running these experiments. Now, there's also the issue in how libraries themselves are implemented. So in the Python imaging library, there was an example where some specific function was implemented differently. It was actually implemented correctly in that library, but it was implemented incorrectly in libraries like PyTorch and like OpenCV and stuff. And so that's an example where the library that a researcher chooses to use would change the way that and the actual performance of the model. And there's also issues in test set construction. First, there's label leakage, in which data features basically contain information about the target that the model is trying to predict on. So it makes the learning problem redundant, because in the input data itself, the input data gives direct information about the target problem. So the model doesn't need to make a prediction. It can just check if the input has that feature. And if so, then the learning problem is easy for the model. It's also the issue of test set size. So this is fairly easy to prevent, but if a test set size is too small, it can result in incorrect inference about performance, because really you want to have a decently sized test set to allow for inference when comparing two different models. Because if the test set size is too small, then one model can easily randomly perform better than the other. There's also the issue of contaminated data. So in this, in a very public data set, they actually found an overlap within the training and test set. There's a 10% overlap in the data that's in this data set. And so that can result in overestimating model performance, because a model is not being given entirely new and independent data for testing. Now, there's also the issue of overfitting from test set reuse. Now, there's the connection of a test set to the actual underlying distribution it's supposed to represent, the underlying population distribution. It's only really guaranteed and ensured if this test set is not reused. But surprisingly, there's been decades-long reuse of some of these test sets. And surprisingly, there hasn't been overfitting that has occurred. But it's still important to keep this in mind to prevent overfitting from occurring in the future. There's also difficulty controlling algorithmic details within the actual experimental setup. So often models are given unequal amounts of time to compute compared to the benchmark models. So researchers basically they often spend a lot of time finding the best hyperparameters for their network, finding the best network architecture, using a bunch of computational power. And often the baseline models are not actually given the same time to learn the best hyperparameters, learn the best network architecture. And so because of that, there have actually been studies that have been conducted, and they've shown that many of these so-called improvements upon the baselines are not often due to some significant change in the way that an architecture is built, but rather their changes can mainly be attributed to things like hyperparameter tuning. Now, let's move on to external validity. So there's the issue of transfer types. Now, transfer types come in two forms. So first, there's algorithm transfer, in which the correlation between the relative performance of an algorithm over one or more baselines or algorithm transfer is basically the correlation between this performance on one learning problem to essentially another learning problem for one specific algorithm. Whereas a learning problem transfer refers to the fact that most of or all of the algorithms under a learning problem transfer to another learning problem. So correlation trends with any algorithm that's run on some learning problem may result in some sort of correlation with another learning problem. So as we can see, these are just simple plots of correlation, but really they can be for either algorithm transfer or learning problem transfer. Now, it's important in literature to identify cases in which there actually are learning problem transfer, because we want to develop algorithms that easily can be run on different learning problems. They can easily be run on different data sets, easily be run on when the metrics are different. And so that's actually how algorithmic progress results. Often we have an algorithm that has been trained on one particular learning problem, and we know somehow that it's going to transfer well to another learning problem. And we can make improvements based on that. Hopefully you noticed that some of the challenges that we discussed early on in the presentation actually fall under the external validity issues. So we discussed metric misalignment or improper metrics being used to assess patient outcomes. So often metrics that are used can actually distinguish performance between different models. So we need a combination of metrics, or we need to create new evaluation procedures for actually determining what model is better than the other. There's also the issue of data set misalignment and several issues under that, including confounding variables, which we discussed, that basically relates to how a particular model that's run on one data set can fare on another. So for example, if, like I mentioned the example earlier of having a ruler with skin lesions, if there's a particular data set that includes that item in images, for example, that model may not translate well to another learning problem, which is defined by a different data set. Again, there's data set shift, which occurs when you try and apply a model to a changing population distribution. And there's also data set bias, which we discussed in terms of the data set not being representative of underrepresented populations and groups. Now, there's also another issue, which is harder to quantify and it's more nuanced, and it's the issue of relating these validity. It's the issue of comparing models to human baselines, because often these models are not actually transferable. And even though they may have superhuman performance, they may perform better than experts in the field. They may be validated and they may perform better than experts. But if the learning problem is even slightly altered, then it's easier for a human to adjust to that new learning problem, whereas often the machine learning model has a harder time and has issue with generalizing to new learning problems. Now, there's been this study that was run basically to see the average number of data sets and metrics that were used. So basically using these, you can look at the number of learning problems that were considered within a study. So in this study, there were 140 papers that were randomly sampled from prominent journals in the past 5 years. And the researchers cut out studies that were not reflective of this benchmark evaluation process that they defined. But on the remaining 103 studies, they evaluated these data sets. They evaluate to see the average number of data sets and metrics used within the papers. What they found is that there's 4.1 data sets and just over 2 metrics that are being used. So really, that's not a large number of learning problems per paper. And so one important thing to consider is in the future is really how well these learning problems transfer. If we have different papers that are researching the same task, but doing it through different learning problems, we want to see if models that are being developed are actually transferable across these learning problems, because the papers themselves are not considering that. And perhaps that's one place where improvement can occur is there's not really an ideal number of data sets and metrics that should be used, but perhaps it would be easier to see transferability across different learning problems if researchers did it themselves in their own studies. Now, there are several takeaways that I hope you gained today throughout today's lecture. First, challenges arise both in the translation of ML to clinical practice and the science of developing algorithms. There are solutions that have been proposed, but they have not been implemented yet. And it's important to consider these solutions, but also develop new ones and consider new ones, and constantly iterate on these processes to improve the transition of ML research to clinical practice. And also, by framing the benchmark evaluation process, which is the standard way that machine learning research is done currently, by framing that in relation to learning problems and broader tasks, we can better identify where challenges fall and how to best address them, who to go to address them, and what we can do as researchers to address them, and how much of it is up to the actual institutions, clinical institutions themselves. And just as a final thought, I found an interesting point when I was preparing this lecture that was often, and it was related to the entire benchmark evaluation process and the idea that current research, the way it's done is really in a way of improving upon baselines. Like researchers are, they're super focused on improving upon the metrics, but they tend to ignore patient outcomes themselves. They're more focused on the actual metrics rather than the patient outcomes, which may not really be influenced by improved metrics. And so one of the things that one of the papers brought up was the fact that this can create like a sort of competitive testing environment because you're constantly being driven to improve on metrics rather than actually focus on the patient outcomes and what's important to the clinical workflow. So I think by keeping what's important to clinical workflows in mind, it would better help not only tailor the research itself, but also create a more collaborative environment for doing so. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nikhil, for a fantastic overview of the post-research deployment challenges in both machine learning science and the specific considerations for machine learning in medicine. That was a great overview. Thank you.